All right. So welcome to Race, Place, and Inequality. But this is for the readings, the white space. With that being said, though, white space I do think is very important. And so we're going to spend for this lecture, we're going to spend time talking about white space and particularly the iconic ghetto. As one of Elijah Anderson's, he's a sociologist out of Yale. So with that being said, let us go to the next slide. And I would like for you to watch this video. It's interesting. And after watching this video, I want you to answer these questions to yourself. I will go ahead and share it. If for some reason YouTube takes it out, because sometimes they do that, that's why I have the link in the slide, and then you can just watch it on, you can just pause the video and watch it on your own and then come back to this lecture. But I will go ahead and share it. But we're going to watch this video, and then after we watch it, go ahead and talk about it, answer some questions about it. Let's see, where are we? Okay, so I don't know, so yes. Thought it would pull up. Oh, here it is. Okay. Actually, let me do this, because there we go, because I got to share the sound too. There we go. All right.
I'll give you 2.5 of my 10-piece chicken McNuggets for a quarter of your quarter pounder with cheese.
But judging by weight, mine's worth at least 4 chicken McNuggets.
From a cost standpoint, they're of equal value.
But I'm older, so.
Get 2 of your faves like 10-piece McNuggets or a quarter pounder for just $6, only at McDonald's.
Okay. So, after watching that video, whether you were able to watch it here or had to just click the link, so what would you do in that situation? So just, something to think about. What would you do in the situation, or have you even been in that situation before, where either you were a person of color and you were subjected to discrimination by being followed in a store, or or something like that, or maybe you saw a person of another racial group being discriminated against, right? Being somewhere where they're not supposed to be, or because they looked a certain way, they got chastised, or they were ostracized in a way that other people who could be in that group wouldn't be, or could be in that space wouldn't be. How did the white people respond versus the Black person? Did you see a difference in the response? After watching this video, what did you learn about Black people in white space? So clearly that space appeared to be a white space, but there was also a class element to it as well, because first it was kind of like a white space, right? So you see predominantly white people, you think, well, people who could afford this more than likely are going to be white people who can afford a $600 jacket or a $1,000 suit or something like that, right? But we also know that there are people of other racial groups that have money, that can afford, high-end things, right? So it was interesting, the young lady said he could be, I think she said, an entertainer or a rapper or a celebrity or something, right? That there was kind of like some implication there as well that we could possibly even tease out. But needless to say, regardless of what the person's occupation is, there are ways in which people can make a lot of money so that they can afford those things in the store. So there are these racial implications, but then there are also these kind of class nuances as well. And so it got to the end where the gentleman was Black, but he was not accosted in the same way that Damon was, who was dressed up, you know, like a street guy or thug or whatever, the, you know, fake locks and everything. He was dressed in a look like a business suit. So he's almost kind of saying, though I look, because I'm Black, I look like I don't deserve to be here. I'm gonna wear this nice suit. I'm gonna wear this nice jacket so that maybe that'll tell you, give you the hint like, oh, well, he's Black, but he might be one of those rich Blacks. So we won't bother him, right? And he knew that. That's why he said that at the end, if I was here in my ball cap or dressed, you know, similarly to how I would normally dress, I've been, you know, subjected to discrimination before. So you see these kind of race and class things happening here. So something interesting to think about, something to, you know, to talk about with your roommate or mom or, you know, spouse or kids or whatever. And, you know, kind of like what we saw there. And so with that being said, I want to just dive right into the to some of the main points of this reading. Number one or two is white space and Black space. And then number three, we're going to talk about the iconic ghetto, right? And so the first thing we're going to talk about is white space. And white space is essentially settings previously occupied by white people, such as white neighborhoods, schools, universities, workplaces, restaurants, and other public spaces, which Black people often consider to be off limits for people like them, right? So that is essentially what we call white space. And so Black people typically perceive settings as white space because they often believe that they're not for them. Even if they can afford it, even if legally they should be able to be there, even if they are able to be there, they still consider it a white space. Even if you talk about universities, right? Universities, even if you look at UNF, the way in which UNF was built and why UNF is built where it is in the city was because of white space. It was not ideal for them to want to have African-Americans in the northern part of the city, where the more poor and working class African-Americans tend to live in Jacksonville. They didn't want to have the university downtown so that they could have access to it. So there's a reason why it's on the south side. There's a reason why it's in an area that is more middle class, by the beach, more white people. It was built that way. Obviously, over time, civil rights movement, opportunities are extended to African Americans. Now you have people of all racial groups that attend UNF, but it's still essentially a white space because its initial creation was for that, right? It was for white students, white college students, right? And so that is why they say universities, because initially the major universities outside of historically Black colleges were created for white people, right? So again, you can have spaces that now allow people of color or now allow Black people, but initially that was not what they were created for. So it's kind of an addendum, and people of color or Black people have to find their ways into those spaces. And so so that's why we say off limits for people like them, because some people may say, well, universities aren't just for white people, they're for everybody. You know, anybody can go. That's true, but initially that's what they were built for. Meanwhile, despite the growth of an enormous Black middle class, a lot of white people assume that the natural Black space is a place that is impoverished, that is fearsome, you know, areas that you will see in the media or in books or in TVs or music or movies or news. And this is otherwise called the iconic ghetto. And so generally when we see examples of Black spaces, in movies or in TV shows or in the news, when you see Black people or a group of Black people together or Black spaces, more often than not, it is within these kind of ghettoized conditions, the poor neighborhoods, the working class neighborhoods, hanging out in the streets, hanging out on the corner stores, right? And so because this is typically what people see, this is the idea of Black space. Always impoverished, people always in fear, right? And so this then becomes the symbolization of the ghetto. And the ghetto then becomes a symbol of Blackness. And this is why Elijah Anderson calls this concept the iconic ghetto, because it looks at the ghetto as this icon of Blackness. And so white people typically avoid Black space, right? Because they don't want to be involved or associated with the ghetto in a way that is negative, maybe in a way that's cool. So sometimes when you have cool things that come out of the ghetto, maybe music or dancing or something like that, or whatever is popular in culture, it catches on to the wider culture, to the dominant culture. And so sometimes you may have white people that may use the slang or may listen to the music or may recite the lyrics or whatever, but essentially, but they don't necessarily want to live there or experience the same conditions, right, that a lot of people there experience, right? And so you have, again, this idea of the iconic ghetto, of liking it from afar, but not necessarily wanting to engage or associate with those people or the people in those areas or what that area represents. And then on top of that, there is this idea, and we're going to talk about this more later, there's this idea that this ghettoized mentality or ghetto culture or ghetto language or ghetto behavior applies to all Black people. So even if you are a middle-class Black person, even if you are a Black person of means, even if you are a Black person that has never lived in the ghetto or does not live in the ghetto, there, because the iconic ghetto is attributed to Black people, then it's automatically attributed to a Black person, regardless of their class. That's why Elijah Anderson calls it the iconic ghetto and not, you know, the actual ghetto or the ghetto reality, right? And so white people typically avoid this Black space physically, but may engage with it culturally. And that's probably the thing I would add to this. He says white people typically avoid it altogether, but not necessarily from a cultural standpoint. But Black people are required to navigate the white space as a condition of their existence. So white people don't have to come into contact with Black space if they don't want to. But white people don't have to come into contact with Black space if they don't want to. I think that's what I said. But Black people have to come into contact with white space at some point in their existence. Many times they don't have a choice. And so both spaces can be diversified, right? Both white space and Black space, nuanced and broken down even further along ethnicity lines and class lines. Ethnicity lines because the young lady said, you know, I'm from Eastern Europe and this would never happen in Europe. So, you know, these things are broken down along ethnic lines as well as class lines, right? Because the Black middle class gentleman, right, we assume he's Black middle class, in the video had on the nice jacket, the nice suit, understood I have to look this way in order to navigate this space with ease, or some relative, or with some relative ease, right? So there are these lines, right, that we have to consider. Also, if you're a Black person in a poor white space, may be different. You may not get the same treatment. You may get a different kind of discrimination, right? A poor white person in a high-end white place may get treated in a similar way as a Black person, maybe not get the cops called on them, but maybe seen as somebody who might steal because they came in without the right outfit on or didn't look like they had money, right? So there are these kind of ways in which it can be nuanced, but in these kind of broader conversations, you're more than likely to see this along these kind of racial lines, but it can get nuanced. So while the respective white and Black spaces may appear to be racially homogenous, and typically they can also be subclassified into these other social identities. So in order for us to really break down this idea of white space, I think it's necessary for us to provide some kind of historical context. I always think it's important to do that. Number one, because having this historical context in story allows us to see, even more significant or see even more the significance of the discourse, number one. Number two, this is a class that has sociologists, anthropologists, Africana studies, as people from various disciplines. And so I like to merge those together when we are, when we're having these kind of discussions. And so I want to start off with talking about basically how historically Black people have occupied a low space in the United States. And when I'm talking about historically, I'm just talking about the age of European expansion, right? Past that, we're talking a whole different thing. But within the age of European expansion, when Europe started to colonize and take over various parts of the West as well as the East, people of color, particularly Black people after 1619, occupied a low space in the United States, either indentured servitude or enslavement or as second-class citizens. So they always had lived in this kind of caste-like status. That's what Du Bois talks about, even Isabel Wilkerson. And so you have these low spaces that Black people are in, that Black people are living in, all throughout their time in the United States. Then you have the Civil Rights Movement. And so the Civil Rights Movement was this time where you have this large push, and not only large push by Black people, but this time they were able to convince white people, liberal white people, people all across the globe, immigrants, people of other racial groups to join in this effort to create a better America for everybody, right? So the Civil Rights Movement turning into a human rights movement, there's this big push, and it leads to actual political change, because now you actually have acts, you actually have legislation that is put in place to protect people of color, protect all racial groups from discrimination, right? So the Civil Rights Movement ends up leading to increasing opportunities for Black people. But what we find is that the only Black people that are able to take advantage of these opportunities are the Black middle class. So if you're a Black person who already had money and all you needed was the opportunity to go to a new school or go to a good school or live in a good neighborhood, and the only thing that was holding you back was money, then when the law was passed, boom, you can go to whatever school you wanted to, boom, you can go live in whatever neighborhood. But what if you were one of those, and this was the majority of Black people at that time, what if you were one of those Black people who didn't have the money, who didn't have the opportunity, who didn't have the nice white person that would stick up for you and say, hey, let my friend in this school, or my friend should be able to live in this neighborhood, or whatever. Everybody doesn't have that white ally. And usually a person who would have that white ally would be a Black middle class person, not a poor Black person. So if you're a poor or working class Black person, that legislation really didn't do much for you, because now that you can go live with white people, you don't have the money to do it. This is when we see the murder of Dr. King. So Dr. King is murdered in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. And when he gets murdered, riots break out in cities all across the nation, because they're saying, now this was the peaceful one. You kill other Black leaders, didn't like that either, but they were also telling people to take up and move in self-defense. You're gonna kill the nice one. You're gonna kill the one that told us to be peaceful. So this is when Black people began to riot and break out and resort to violence or self-defense all across the nation. And so as Black people grew increasingly insistent and militant, it was in this context that the federal government said, you know what, we have to pass some legislation to make sure that we protect the citizenship and the citizenry of Black people in America. And so this is when you start to see them targeting for reform around segregated workplaces, neighborhoods, schools, universities in the end of the 1960s, going into the 1970s. This is when you start to see busing. This is when you start to see affirmative action. This is when you start to see the Fair Housing Act. You start to see all these things happening at the end of the 60s and 70s after these riots, right? And so now we're going to start to see why white space and the study of white space is important, because now more Black people are starting to actually understand what it means to be in white space consistently, not just go and work in a white man's farm or business and then leave, but now living and working and sending my kids to school here and going to these churches. Now it's going to be very, very different. And so again, what we see is, because of the racial incorporation process, now you have the Black middle class that has moved into these areas. And because now they have access to the schools, now they have access to the jobs, now they have access to the neighborhoods. But when they got there, they experienced what they call resegregation through two ways. Mary Patillo in Black Picket Fences says that they were segregated racially because of unfair housing practices, redlining that took place well up until the 90s. So redlining, where they weren't even allowed to get realtors to show them predominantly white spaces or spaces that were increasing in value so that they could make money and create wealth for their families. So that's the first thing. The second thing was with this resegregation that was occurring post desegregation, this resegregation was happening because as more and more Black people are now moving into these suburbs, more and more white people are saying, we don't want to live here. And they're moving even further out, or they're moving into different suburbs. So Black people are chasing the white people into the suburbs and the white people are running away. That's why it's called white flight. Whole set of scholarly research, right, that looks at white flight. So white people essentially begin to flee. And so now these Black middle class, what was white spaces, now became mixed spaces, now are Black middle class suburbs. But in terms of like phenotype, in terms of their skin color, most of them are virtually indistinguishable from Black people who reside in the ghetto. And so oftentimes when they move into these areas, right, into these areas of means, into these white middle class areas, they get profiled. They get profiled on occasion for various reasons, but particularly because they look like the people that they left. And so you have two options for the Black middle class. One, to live in a predominantly Black middle class neighborhood that's next to the ghetto, or two, live in the exclusive white neighborhood and their children have to navigate predominantly white spaces. Either way, there's a give and take. It's there are pros and cons. And so even if they stay connected to their family members or whoever that live in the poor and working class areas or live in the ghetto, their lives are still in very much contrast to them, especially when they are enacting professional roles. But then even when they're in their professional roles, they still don't get a lot of credit when they are in those roles, right? Because sometimes people may not believe them when they say they're a doctor, or they're a lawyer, or they're an engineer, or they're a CEO, right? And so then going to the next slide, this is why, or this is where we get this notion of the iconic ghetto. And so whether a Black person is from the ghetto or the suburbs, Black skin designates them as being from the ghetto. No matter what their class status is, no matter what their skin color is, whether they're lighter skin, brown skin, darker skin. And so this is what Elijah Anderson is talking about when he's talking about the iconic ghetto. And while this is happening, the actual physical Black ghetto still persists, even though it also appears to be on the verge of self-destruction now because of deindustrialization. But actual ghettos have now been deindustrialized. So I'll just give you a quick history lesson. In the 1930s, 40s, you had factories. Even before that, you had factories popping up all over the United States, particularly in the downtown areas, big Ford, plants, steel plants, plants that made cans. I mean, just anything. And these big businesses, manufacturing hubs, were hiring poor, uneducated, or working class Black people, particularly Black men. At that time, Black men did not have the opportunity to get, most of them did not have the opportunity to get a quality education. So to go and get a degree and get a higher paying management position was highly unlikely. The only option they had were those factory jobs. And so that's where you had a majority of Black folks and white folks. So in places like Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Cincinnati, all of these, Chicago, if you were poor, working class, whether you were Black or white, it didn't matter. That was the job for you. You go, you work your 40 hours a week, you get paid, and you take care of your family. And that helped to stimulate the American economy in the 50s and in the 60s. But something happened in the 1970s. In the 1970s, William Julius Wilson said deindustrialization happened. William Julius Wilson is I think he ended up teaching at Harvard, but he was initially at the University of Chicago, sociologist, a very, very well-known sociologist. And he said deindustrialization happened. And what happened was, as America began to move from being a manufacturing economy to a knowledge-based economy, where now people are going to school and majoring in things where you need a certain amount of knowledge or expertise in, right? So we're moving from making money off of goods, providing services or goods really, to providing a service. So now instead of working with your hands in the factories, now people are majoring in psychology to provide a service, to be a psychologist, or medicine, to be a doctor, or whatever, right? Now we're moving to service-oriented jobs that require a specific knowledge, teachers, things like that. And so these jobs start to get shipped overseas, because now the big capitalists are starting to realize, oh, wait, I'm paying these Americans $5 an hour, and I got to give them health insurance. Or I could take this hub and take it to Thailand and pay them $2 an hour with no health insurance and pocket the rest of that money. I think I'm gonna do that. And so that's essentially what happened. Deindustrialization means that the industries in these big cities started to go overseas. And so that does really good for the owner. But what happens to all those jobs? 200, 300, 500, 1,000 people that were working in those factories. What happened to them? They don't have a job. They can just get another one, but they're uneducated. They don't have that opportunity. So where do they go? It doesn't matter to me. That's what the capitalists are saying. And so because of that, now you start to see an increase in crime, and you start to see a decrease in education, a decrease in men in the family, men in the homes. You start to see an increase in crime and also an increase in drug use. And then it leads into a lot of the ghettoized conditions of the 1980s. So again, as the American economy started to change from being manufacturing industry to high technology industry and being globalized, inner city communities, particularly inner city Black communities, were the ones that started to suffer. And so, and again, these areas were formerly sustained by these jobs. The people who also helped these communities were now moving to the suburbs. And so because of that, the notion of this iconic ghetto and how this is relating to these people who are moving over, not overseas, but moving out to the suburbs, it becomes even more complicated. These people are considered rough people. This is considered a Black ghetto. And so then what you see is now you see actual ghettos, as well as what is perceived as ghetto in the minds of white people are now there's this creation of the iconic ghetto. Now, most people in the white space don't necessarily look on the actual or iconic ghetto from a structural lens. Most of them, when they look at the ghetto, they think, well, people are living in this position because they are lazy, because they're criminals, right? They associate the ghetto with danger and crime and poverty. That is what they associate the iconic ghetto with. They're not looking at it from a structural lens. They don't know, either they don't know or they don't care to make the connection between the story I just told you about how ghettos came to be and these people. So they're not looking at it from, oh, this was created on purpose, not because these people don't want to work. Oh, there's a high level of joblessness, unemployment or underemployment, and high influx of drugs into these communities purposely, which is why these things are happening. But without that structural lens, the iconic ghetto just seems to be something that Black people just like, or they just want, or they're just naturally, these criminals are naturally like to live in poverty. And so again, this ghetto as an icon symbolizes this distressed place to which Black people are just relegated to, apart from the larger society. And it causes this universal low opinion of Black people as a group. And then it allows for prejudice to persist, because now it's a source of stereotypes. It's a source of rationalization. It's a source of unfair legislation. It's the reason why people can say, oh, well, if they want to be here or they're just being lazy, then yeah, we can pass laws to make sure there are more police in these areas. Yeah, we can pass laws to build more prisons. Yeah, we can pass laws to, because why? Of this iconic ghetto perception. And so a significant but undetermined number of people in these larger societies, particularly people who occupy the white space, they look on these iconic ghettos with fear, with judgment. And they have these visions, these assessments, and again, ignore the structural poverty, the sociological reasons as to why the inner city ghetto exists and why people live that way. And so in these circumstances, the ghetto is poor. These people are seen as pariahs, piranhas, and they're more likely to be victimized other than to be victims themselves of the larger society. And so again, talking more about segregation, because of that, so we talked about how the ghetto came to be in like the 70s and 80s and 90s, and the ghetto continues, going to the next slide. Unfortunately, segregation did and continues to persist, particularly in the form of education and residential. And just so you don't think I was making this up, I just went and found this quick link. So the civil rights movement is long past, yet these things still persist. The wider society is still replete with overwhelmingly white neighborhoods, white schools, white universities, and we'll talk about the residential segregation next week with American apartheid. We can talk about that there. But for now, right? Yeah. Restaurants, schools, universities, workplaces, churches. There's so much research, particularly around education and residents, as to how the segregation still exists. And so these are perceived as white spaces. And Elijah Anderson says, and they must be handled with care, because when they are allowed to be in these spaces, Black people typically have to be absent. They're not expected or they're marginalized when they're present. So in turn, Black people often refer to these spaces again as white. And their idea, this idea of white space, is another perceptual category. The iconic ghetto is a perception and white space is a perception. And they typically approach that space very, very carefully. And so the question is, how do Black people navigate this space? How do Black people navigate the white space? One thing is, when present in the white space, Black people start to reflect the proportion of white to Black people. In other words, they ask the question, how many Black people gonna be there? Or when they go, they kind of look and see, well, not a lot of Black people here. Or, oh, it's some Black people here. Okay, cool. Another thing they may do, they may bring a Black person with them. Hey, come with me to this thing. I just don't know who all there. So come with me. Or are there spaces where Black people can escape to? These are the things that measure the comfort level of Black people when they have to navigate white space. And then with the bring a Black person with you, okay, I can bring one or two, but I can't bring too many because then there might be too many of us and then they might feel threatened. So I might just bring one or two of my best friends and then that's it. However, the same settings are generally regarded for white people as what? These two white settings can be off limits for Black people, but how do white people see these settings? What do they call it? Normal. Normal. It's life. So that's why, generally speaking, a lot of white people, when they enter into these settings, they don't even notice. They may not even notice the lack of minority or people of color. They may not notice the lack of Black people or whatever, because to them, this is life. This is what they've always seen. And so that's why it takes a sociological lens, a sociological imagination. That's why you take these classes, to then be able for people's eyes to open and see the world from other people's lenses. So while operating in the white space, again, Black people are subject to social, if not physical, jeopardy. They navigate these white spaces and they risk some penalty, some punitive transgression, in trying to conduct themselves in an ordinary way while also being Black at the same time. So there are these punishments for negative actions or perceptions in a white space, even if they didn't do anything wrong, even if they're just being normal. But because the iconic ghetto hovers over the idea of white space, Black space, white identity, and Black identity, there's this social plateau that foreshadows certain evaluations. And they have little to do with who the person is or what they're doing in actuality. But when you're moving into a white space, Black people have to endure these challenges all the time of how they navigate it, how comfortable they're going to feel, but then they also have to measure the comfortability of white people in that space, particularly white people of authority. And so this is the the dynamics and the complexities of navigating white space. Other things that Black people tend to have to do when they're navigating white space is they have to perform in a way that can lead them to move past, it can lead them to either pass or fail certain inspections. So depending on how well the Black person is performing, the white person may say, okay, you can stay. For example, the Black guy in the store in the video. He had the right costume on. He had the right performance. So he wasn't harassed. That's what he said. If I wear this, I may not get harassed. I still might, but I might not. I'm less likely, at least, than if I wear my normal clothing. So these are the performances that Black people have to make sure they participate in order to pass these inspections. And then they might have provisional acceptance into the white space. But other people may need to prove additionally why they have to be in that space. And again, this happens in, like in the video, in upscale restaurants, and in shopping malls, grocery stores, right? So they have to demonstrate essentially that the ghetto stereotype does not apply to them. Because as soon as they're seen, it is this idea that they represent the iconic ghetto. And so then what happens is eventually, when Black people experience this enough in their reality, they start to become cynical of the larger system. So then people ask the question, well, why are they so angry? Why don't they want to come over here? Well, how come they're so standoffish? Well, when you've experienced that since you were 8 or 9, all the way up until your 20s or 30s, sometimes it just gets overwhelming. And you kind of say, okay, there's nothing going to change. And so because of that, going to the next slide, they have to create some responses. One, avoid white space as soon as possible. They may try to avoid it altogether, right? By saying, okay, if I have to enter it, I'll enter, do what I have to do, and then get out. And then sometimes when white people leave a white space, they feel relieved, or sometimes they may regret it because maybe they left prematurely. Because if they're honest, white spaces can give you certain rewards, economic and social rewards. You get certain levels of education, you might get a job, there's certain privileges, prestige, money, promise of acceptance. So there are these rewards for being in white space. But the challenge is, what is it going to have to sacrifice? What do I have to sacrifice for? My dignity, my self-respect, constant subjugation, sending my kids to a white school, sure. There may be some rewards, but is it worth constant being putting down, teachers mistreating them, getting called every other day that my child's been suspended or written up for something small that other children aren't getting suspended or written up for? Is it worth it? And every Black person has to decide if they're in a space that is perpetuating that. And so these are the responses that a lot of Black people have. You have Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I put her story up here if you wanted to read it. She was a tenure track professor at the University of North Carolina. She did a phenomenal rollout called the 1619 Project in 2019. It was exactly 400 years since Black people first came to the United States as enslaved people. And it was phenomenal. I mean, it was all over the New York Times. It was all over the world. They were teaching. I was teaching it in my classes. Professors were teaching it everywhere. This 1619 project was huge. And it was incredible. I mean, just a layout of the history of slavery in America, phenomenal. And she wasn't tenured yet at UNC, and they denied her. And it went viral everywhere. People all over, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, everybody. How can you not offer Nicole Hannah Jones tenure? And it's not like she's getting tenure at Harvard. Harvard is hard to get tenure, especially if you're Black. It's real hard. They're notorious for making it very difficult for people of color to get tenure, i.e. Cornel West, i.e. some of his colleagues. Okay, so, but it wasn't even hard. It wasn't even Harvard. It was UNC, a good school, but it's not hard. It wouldn't. Somebody who does work like that should easily be able to get tenure. They denied her tenure. Most people believe it was because of racism. North Carolina, it's in the South, still very much a conservative state. Probably didn't like the fact that this 1619 project didn't make white people feel too good about the history of slavery in America. So they got pushback from all over the country. They reevaluated, came back and said, okay, we'll offer Dr. Jones tenure. She said, thank you, but I declined. And she ended up getting a large grant. She got a lot of research dollars, I think like in the millions. And she ended up leaving UNC. And now she's teaching at Howard University, a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. And she explains why she left. And the reason why was largely because of what Elijah Anderson says, that these white spaces are places where Black people navigate to try to find a sense of humanity, to try to make a difference. And when they feel they are not appreciated, then they leave those white spaces, or they try to avoid it again altogether, or leave it as soon as possible. And I think she said something about going where you're celebrated, not where you're tolerated. Something along those lines she talks about in her response to why she did not accept tenure at University of North Carolina. Right. So looking at her story and looking at her response is just a real life example of what Elijah Anderson is conceptualizing in this piece. So the next slide, which is the last slide about information. Remember I was talking about Black people moving from the inner city, they move to the suburbs, you have the white flight, then white folks leave there, they move to what they call exurbia, so they move to the outside of the suburbs. But then I said, but there's another part to it. What you start to see in the latter part of the 20th century and in the 21st century is gentrification. So now you have white people who are living in white spaces. They're now what? They're now desiring Black spaces. They see the cities. They see the way the cities look. They're beautiful, big buildings, stores, markets. I can just walk to the store. I can just walk to the parks. Oh, can't do that in the suburbs. You got to drive everywhere. Oh, I think I want to live there. Well, that's where the inner city poor Black people are. So they start to slowly but surely move into those areas. And when they move back into those inner city areas, what happens to the housing values and the land values? They go up. And now those poor Black people and working class Black people that live there, they can't afford it anymore because they can't afford the taxes. Because they can't afford the taxes, now they're dislocated. And now Black space becomes what? White space. So your assignment, web assignment, white space. In this link, 2 Black men were arrested. The There's two black men, they're teenagers. They're arrested because they were accused of stealing a car, right? So the cops pull these kids over because they were driving this really nice car in a nice part of California. And so that's where it starts. I just want to give you the backstory. So when you click the link, you see what's happening. Okay. Now I want you to watch this link. It's real short, but I think it gets you to the point. And it gives you a lot to think about because it's literally a lot of what we've talked about in just this one clip from this show. So in a 1 to 2 page paper, I want you to explain how some parts of the lecture on white space can be seen in this clip from this show. Literally, and I don't want you to just say, I see the iconic ghetto when he did this. Explain it, give me detail so that you're showing me that you have a knowledge of the material. How do you see the concept of the iconic ghetto played out in this clip? Not just one sentence. That's why I say 1 to 2 pages, because I want you to give me details. I want you to say in the slide, you know, Professor Grant, we talked about this, and I can see that in this part of the clip when the person did this, or when the person did this. This reminded me of what we talked about in this part of the lecture, which is actually very significant to what we saw in the video with it. Now you're showing me that you can put the pieces together. That's what I like to see. That's what's going to get you an A. Okay. And even better, if you can make connections to even other readings. Now I'm really excited. Because now you're showing me that you know you're getting something out of this class. Okay. So that's what I want to see. So for those who are watching this, for those who don't watch the lecture videos and they're just reading the PowerPoints, then you're going to miss all this goodness. But if you're actually watching this all the way to the end, then you get a better understanding of what I'm looking for. So that's how you get an A on these assignments. How did class play a role in how the parents were able to combat racism by the police? So we see the parents are of a certain means when they're dealing with these cops. How did class play a role? Talk about it. Make a connection. We've been talking about the black middle class for the past hour and some change. Make that connection. Show me. What did I say in the lecture that you see in the video, that you see and show me that you really understand this material. Okay. All right. The paper should be double spaced, Times New Roman, 12 font, and the only information that should be at the top of the page is your name, the name of the class, and the title of the essay, which is optional. This email, inbox, office hours. I'm enjoying students coming in the office hours and the conversations that we've been having. If you have any questions or you just want to talk about the class, feel free. And I hope you have a great day, great week, and great weekend.